What if you get CERB and weren't eligible? Will you get audited? Then what? I've got a first-time guest with all of the answers, and it starts right now.
This is Debt Free in 30. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
When the COVID-19 lockdown started, the federal government created CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. Eligible Canadians were able to receive $2,000 for each 4-week period. The first period started March 15th, and the final period, period 7, ended on September 26th, so the maximum CERB payout was $14,000. There were almost 9 million Canadians who applied for CERB, and the government paid out over $81 billion in CERB benefits. But there were eligibility requirements. You had to have earned at least $5,000 in the last 12 months or in 2019 from employment or self-employment or provincial maternity or paternity benefits, whatever that is. You had to be off work due to COVID, and you didn't quit your job voluntarily. And if you were working part-time, you were not allowed to earn more than $1,000 for at least 14 days during the 4-week period you were applying for. Makes sense, but unlike other government programs like employment insurance, where you apply and the government confirms your eligibility before they give you the money, with CERB, because the government wanted to distribute the money quickly, there was very little upfront eligibility verification. You went online, clicked a few buttons, and you got the money. But what if you got CERB and you weren't eligible? Think back to what the world was like in March 2020. The situation was changing quickly, so the Prime Minister and the Premier and the President of the United States were having daily press conferences, constantly updating what was going on. Government benefits kept evolving. With that level of uncertainty, many people were worried. The lockdown had started, many businesses were closed, and many people didn't know when they would be allowed to go back to work. They were worried about being able to pay their rent and buy food. So what is an individual Canadian supposed to do? Do you hire an accountant or a lawyer to review the CERB eligibility rules to make sure you qualify before you apply? No. You need money now, so you apply for CERB. And because there were almost 9 million people applying in a very short period of time, and since the government had to get it up and running very quickly, they decided to allow 2 application methods. One was through Service Canada, which manages employment insurance, and the other was Canada Revenue Agency, which manages taxes and was already set up to send money because, well, they have everyone's information on file from their tax return last year. But when you applied through one portal, it wasn't obvious if your application was received, so many people applied through the other portal, and some people ended up getting paid twice for the same period. So now what? What if you got CERB and now you realize you weren't eligible? What if you got double paid? Are you going to get audited? If you do get audited, how can you prove you were eligible? Do you need to hire a lawyer? And what if you know you weren't eligible? Will you get charged with fraud? And it's not just CERB. Employers were able to apply for the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, the CEWS, and again, there were very strict eligibility requirements, but they were not reviewed in detail before the payments were made. So now what? To discuss it, I have a first-time guest on the podcast, so let's get started. Who are you and what do you do?
Good morning. Thank you for having me. And my name is Jason Rosen, one of the founding partners at Rosen Kirshen Tax Law, and we mainly provide representation to taxpayers when they are reviewed or audited by the Canada Revenue Agency and assist them throughout the dispute resolution process.
And Jason, thanks for being here. So I understand what a tax accountant is. I mean, I am a CA, a CPA. I've done some tax returns in my time. I'm not good at it, but I've done them. What is the difference between a tax accountant and a tax lawyer?
We provide effective and efficient representation throughout the audit process, objection stage at the Canada Revenue Agency, and represent many appellants throughout the Tax Court of Canada dispute process. We navigate the legal side as well as the accounting side and combine our knowledge of both systems to provide taxpayers a fighting chance against Canada Revenue Agency.
Gotcha. So you're working with tax accountants all the time. They're the ones who are actually filling out the tax return. You're giving advice before and after. And if there's a problem, then you step in. So, okay. So I understand all that. Now, let's get to the meat of this. Human nature being what it is, there will be people who got CERB who weren't eligible. And I assume the government is going to want their money because that's kind of how governments are. And what do you think the government is going to do to recover the money that they think was paid out inappropriately? What steps can you predict are going to happen here?
It's very trying times. This pandemic is not anything we could have anticipated, and the government is in the same position. So they had managed to go approximately 240% over budget, and the cost of CERB was estimated to be around $82 billion. So in late August, the CRA announced that they were going to be initiating audits and reviews of all recipients for CERB. They can do random selections, which is how they generally initiate audit proceedings in the first place. But with respect to CERB, they have new requirements now to validate payments that employers now have to create 4 additional boxes on their T4s and confirm the dates and times when employees were paid. So CRA can send out questionnaires asking for proof and information regarding your eligibility. And based on that questionnaire, they might ask you to supply supporting documentation to prove that you did not have other sources of income during the relevant periods.
So you hit on a few things there. So typically what CRA would do is, pick a random sample and just say, hey, prove it. They started in August sending out these letters that say, hey, you applied through both Service Canada and CRA, which that ain't right. So, what happened? And they can also then send a questionnaire. So explain to me conceptually what that is. It's a letter that's got a few questions on. Is that what we're talking about?
Audit questionnaires typically ask for background information. So the questions that I would predict one could find on a CERB-related questionnaire would be, when did your employment cease to exist? And when did you start to apply for the CERB? What periods did you apply? And have you been gainfully employed since? So providing that information is something that the CRA may already have, but they want taxpayers to come forward with information as well as supporting documents. And the supporting documents I would suggest one should have ready for a CERB audit would be bank statements, termination letters, as well as any correspondence from potential or current employers.
Now, would you agree that this is going to be a long process? So the first step was, hey, let's send out letters to people who obviously double dipped. And then the second step may be, let's send out some questionnaires. But a lot of that, it sounds to me, won't happen until the new year, because as you said, they're going to require different information to be on your T4 slip. So obviously
Correct.
The government has to get the T4 slip before they can compare it to something else. So T4 slips, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm an employer, so I should know this, I believe they have to be issued by the end of February. Am I correct?
That's correct.
So,
Absolutely.
So now, as an employer, I always issue them on December 31st because that's when the employee gets their last paycheck and there's nothing going to be paid. So we do it on computer and we send them out. But I get it. A lot of employers, still use pens and papers. I'm not sure how they do it. So at the end of February, all the T4s get issued. CRA gets a copy of them. And so it could be March, April, May when they're doing a lot of this cross-checking. Is that possible?
Absolutely. The T4 slip is due at the end of February. As you said, most payroll companies who are processing employer-related documents such as that will do the T4s early February, and diligent taxpayers and employers like yourself would probably do it when the information is complete at the year end. Problem then is our tax returns aren't due until the end of April. So the CRA needs to be able to see both that information, what you're reporting on your 2020 tax return, as well as what's on the T4 slip. But what you did mention is the double dipping. So when the CRA had sent that out, that's stuff that they can get ahead of now and initiate those review processes with respect to double recipients.
So there's going to be many waves of this then. We've got the double dipping review now, and then we'll have a review that happens as a result of what's on T4s, and then another review that happens as a result of what's on tax returns. So this is going to be a discussion topic for most of 2021 by the sounds of it. It's not going to be over tomorrow. So now you mentioned two different words there. You mentioned audit and you mentioned review. So in the context of CRA, what's the difference between an audit and a review, or is there a difference?
Generally, the inner working process at the CRA for both is the same. A T1 processing review is something that is flagged before you get your assessment. Audits typically happen after an assessment because the information on one's tax return is deemed to be true unless it's proven otherwise, right? So they may process your tax return with incorrect or inaccurate information because that's what you've presented to them. Then later down the road, they can come back up to 3 years during the normal reassessment period and review the information that you reported that was processed by them. So one happens pre-processing, and that's the review, and an audit typically happens after an assessment is issued.
Gotcha. So it happens in stages. And you said they can do that up to 3 years after the fact. So I would like you to speculate then, is it possible they will be looking at CERB stuff, not just for the next few months, but it could be as much as 2 or 3 years into the future?
Absolutely. And they can expand the reassessment period for another 7 years if there is a misrepresentation contained in those initial 3 years. Also, the CRA's business plan is not expected to put all of their employees back into full working force until the end of January. So it would be very difficult for them to allocate resources for audits and review without full staff.
Yeah, so it's going to be impossible. And yeah, I mean, you and I both know that a lot of CRA employees are working from home, and which is not as efficient as being in the office where you got your computers and everything else. So things are moving slowly at the moment. Now, I want to go back to this whole thing about documentation. So I know that pretty much every single year, I get a letter from CRA that says, hey, we want to see all the proof of your charitable donations, because every year I file my taxes electronically. There is no pieces of paper that I send them, so I'm not sending in the charitable donation receipts. But every year they say, hey, we want to see the list. So what I do, because I'm pretty smart here, I'm proactive, is when I do my taxes, I prepare a summary. So I've got the sheet that lists every single one, and I've got every single receipt, and I copy them, and I put them all in one file. So I'm ready to go. So 3 months later, when they ask for it, I can say, no problem, let me fax it to you right now, boom, and I'm done. What types of things should I be assembling to be prepared for the inevitable questions from CRA with respect to CERB? So I think you mentioned one of them, which was bank statements. So why did you suggest that?
Bank statements are an important review process document, and it proves that other sources of income or deposits are not being made into your account with respect to the CERB payments.
And obviously, I would want to have my T4 slip, but I guess the government's going to have that as well. Would it be a good idea to keep a copy of my record of employment as well if I got laid off?
That is a very good idea, as well as any other correspondence you have from your employer explaining the termination or the temporary layoff, depending on the situation. You might also want to keep documentation regarding applications you submit for employment, and that might be relevant for the EI purposes if Service Canada is going to be reviewing. And then, of course, it's hard to prove a negative. So if you were doing cash jobs on the side and cash transactions are not illegal, just you need to have proper books and records with respect to that, and maybe invoices for other sources of employment if you are self-employed.
So I think what happened with a lot of people is things were happening quick and their boss said, look, don't come into work. We're laying you off. We've been locked down. And I think in a lot of cases, there wasn't a formal letter of layoff. There wasn't maybe even an ROE right away. Would it be a good idea for me as an employee to go to my boss now and say, hey, boss, I'm still on layoff, or maybe I'm even back to work now. Can you write me a letter or even send me an email or something that says, hey, back in March, the government closed us down because of COVID, so I laid you off. Would that be pretty good evidence that I got laid off because of COVID?
Sounds pretty irrefutable to me, Doug.
Pretty irrefutable. There we go. So we've got some irrefutable legal advice there. Okay, now let's get into the more tricky situations. And I'm getting lots of calls from people, and I'm sure you are too, who say to me, well, I don't know if I did qualify. Like when the lockdown started, I applied because, hey, I needed the money. And, there's all these eligibility requirements. There's this $1,000 thing, and then I had to have made $5,000. And, there was one period where I think I earned $1,200 and I'm only allowed to earn $1,000. So what if I suspect I didn't qualify? And I want two different scenarios here. The first one being, the simple one. I was pretty close, but maybe I made $1,200 instead of $1,000 or whatever. The second scenario would be pretty obviously I didn't qualify, but let's deal with the first one first. What advice would you give to someone in that situation?
So I just have to be clear that the dialogue that we're having today is just information. It cannot be construed as legal advice, and these scenarios are hypothetical. So it's information that I would supply to a prospective client in advance of starting a formal working relationship. So just making sure that the listeners are aware of that, and that the information being provided throughout this podcast cannot be construed as legal advice. In that scenario, if you do not qualify and you know about it in advance, many taxpayers have started to repay that money back to Service Canada or to the Receiver General of Canada. You want to be able to make sure that you're tracking that repayment. So if you're doing it through your online account, keep the receipt. If you are doing it by way of regular mail, you might want to use tracking to ensure that the check is being received by the appropriate authority and that it has been cashed. So that's how you can get ahead of being flagged for a review.
So I know how to pay my taxes online. I've got the online bill payment set up and my account number is my social insurance number. If I had received the CERB through CRA, would it be the same thing? I would just go online and just like making a tax payment? Is it essentially exactly the same process?
CRA has a My Payment portal. So if you're unable to find your tax account through your financial institution's website, you can always visit CRA's My Payment portal, and it's pretty straightforward process to follow. Otherwise, you can just draft a letter and issue a check and send it to the Receiver General.
Okay. So let's say that I did the math and I figured, you know what, I got $2,000 I shouldn't have gotten. Honest mistake, but I got it. I don't have $2,000 to send them today. Should I send them a couple of $100s and then send them another couple of $100 and like pay what I can, or what should I do?
It's always a great option to get ahead of the repayment, because when collections agents at the CRA start enforcing the liability, when it's determined that there is back taxes owed or back CERB owed, you want to just show any sort of diligence, good faith, getting ahead of it. Plus, prepaying it will eliminate any applicable interest from accruing on the amount that you pay as you can afford and as your financial position lets you.
So if you know you're going to owe it, then you might as well start paying, because when you get the inevitable phone call or letter, at least you can say to the agent, look, I know I owe the money. I've been doing my best to pay it back. Okay, they are more likely to cut you a bit of slack than to be coming out with all guns a-blazing, as opposed to, well, I haven't filed my taxes in 5 years. Well, that's when they really get mad.
Yeah, of course. And not to mention the fact that interest does accrue on a daily basis with the CRA. So I cannot predict how far back they're going to start imposing it. Is it from the date that you received the payment? Is it from the date that they noticed that you were going to be ineligible? So it's always a good idea to, make monthly payments or installments towards the money that you're going to owe.
Yeah, if you get paid every 2 weeks, you can send the money every 2 weeks. There's no reason you can't. And I will echo your legal disclaimer that, hey, we're just having a chat here. This ain't legal advice.
I appreciate
and
that.
I will
Thanks.
add to that by saying, you and I don't have a crystal ball. We do not know how CRA is going to deal with all this. We know that there were 9 million Canadians who got this, and we're going to talk about the tax implications of that in a minute. It may be that CRA says, okay, you know what, we're going to make a blanket rule that we don't start accruing interest until January 1st or April 30th, or we don't know. We're purely speculating. So people will have to keep their eyes on that. I want to go to the second scenario then, and maybe the answer is exactly the same, which is, you know what, I know for sure I wasn't eligible, and I got $4,000, $6,000, $8,000, $10,000. Is it the same answer that, well, I guess do what you can to pay it back?
Getting ahead of it is always, and building good faith with the CRA is a great idea. As you suggested, they are more inclined to be lenient with respect to enforcement action when and if that money is actually determined to be owed. And that's, of course, after an audit or a review. The penalties, we don't know what's going to happen with respect to those. Gross negligence penalties are up to 50% of the tax consequences. Then there's also non-filing penalties that could apply. It really depends on a situational basis, but there are mechanisms in place. If you are hit with penalties and interest on these amounts owing, you can always submit a taxpayer relief request, which is a discretionary decision and powers afforded to the minister to waive or reduce the interest and penalties applied to the account.
Yeah, and I would suggest if you got a lot of money and you weren't eligible, that may be a time to talk to a lawyer, because there may be some other issues there. So
it's never too early for that.
It's never too early. We will put your contact information up at the end of this video. Now, we've talked about CERB, and I want to just very quickly touch on, because there's a whole bunch of other programs too. There was the CEWS, the wage subsidy. There was CEBA, which is, what's CEBA?
It's the emergency business account that you can apply for up to $40,000. And recently, I believe most financial institutions in the government have increased that limit to $60,000. And it is a loan with forgiveness on the $40,000. If you meet certain conditions, you will be granted $10,000 of forgiveness. So you'll only have to repay 30 of the 40,000.
So again, there were eligibility requirements for that. And then there was the rent subsidy, the CERS, which has been changed into some new kind of rent subsidy. So there's a couple of those, and it would take us half an hour to explain the machinations there. For somebody who is a business owner, and it might just be a small operator, somebody who had a small restaurant with a few employees or whatever, in general, what is your advice for being ready for the inevitable audit there? So if we take the wage subsidy as the starting point, what are the kind of things I should make sure I've got tucked away for when they ask?
The revenue documentation is important. The periods are constantly changing. The wage subsidy is now in place until the summer of 2021. And there are periods 1 through 4 that have certain requirements, and 5 and 6 and 7 have requirements, 8, 9, and 10 different requirements. So the source documentation for your decline in revenue, which is the baseline figures required for calculation, you want to have your spreadsheets or your online calculator available. You want to have your payroll records. And if you're not sure about your eligibility, it's always a good idea to have somebody spot check your work, whether that's an accountant or a lawyer that's familiar with these programs and the requirements, and you want to make sure that your documentation is perfect, because when the CRA comes, likely it's going to be a very quick turnaround, 15 days, 30 days to supply that information.
Yeah, in my experience, if CRA or anyone else is looking for information, and they call me up and I say, oh, why don't I just email that to you right now? You can have it in 10 seconds. They go, oh, okay, this person probably has their act together. They probably know what they're doing, as opposed to, okay, it's going to take me a few months to assemble it. Well, if it's going to take you a few months, you must not have had it at the beginning. How did you possibly come up with the numbers at the start? So I think you're absolutely right. And for listeners and viewers who aren't familiar with how the wage subsidy worked, you had to have a certain decline in revenue, and as a result, they would subsidize a certain percentage of your wages. Well, that sounds simple when I say it, but it's not as simple when you actually try to fill out the forms. Well, how do you determine the decline in revenue? Which wages are important? And they work on, as you said, 4-week periods. Well, the employer may not pay on 4-week periods. They may pay people weekly or biweekly or semi-monthly or monthly. So there are various little adjustments there. I think it's quite easy to make a mistake. And so I totally agree with you. I think having an accountant or a lawyer who is familiar with this, looking at it up front, and it's not like as a lawyer, you're going to need 5 weeks to review it. You've seen a lot of these things. You can do it fairly quickly. But I think if there's a couple of little technical things you've done wrong, probably better to fix them up front.
Absolutely.
The rental subsidy program, again, we're not going to get into that because there's a couple of different ones. But again, you got to be able to prove you paid rent. That'd be pretty obvious, I'm thinking, right? So, and again, that may seem obvious, but a lot of companies have, a different company they pay rent to and different company. So again, it can be a little bit complicated. I think when people hear this on the news, they go, oh, well, the government's just giving out money. They were giving out money on CERB, and now they're giving all this money to businesses, and people are just getting all this money. Well, yeah, there were people who definitely got money, but certainly from the business end, it's not quite as simple as it sounds. It's not just, push a button and you get the money. So let's go back to the 9 million people who got CERB then. We know, well, you and I know, I assume everyone watching knows, that there was no tax withheld at source. So When you have a job, your boss takes taxes off and sends it to the government. When you get unemployment insurance, or employment insurance as they call it now, the government takes a little bit off in taxes. So you've already prepaid a bit of your taxes. But with CERB, there was zero taxes taken off. So 9 million people next year for 2020 will file their taxes, and their tax bill will be a little higher than they thought, probably because there's this other income. What do you think CRA will do? And again, you're just speculating here. So this is not legal advice. I'm just asking you to blue sky here. Do you think they're going to say, well, the deadline's April 30th, got to file your taxes by April 30th, that's when you got to pay it, that's it, we're going to start charging you? Or do you think they'll do something different?
I would hope that they would implement something like what they did in the summer of 2020 with the deferrals and the non-accrual of interest during the small period of grace. Of course, I don't have a crystal ball, as you mentioned, and I cannot predict what the CRA will do. I've never worked for them, and I'm just a regular taxpayer like everybody else who has increased legal and tax knowledge.
Yeah, so I guess we will find out. I mean, my prediction is it will be a constantly changing environment, because that's the only constant this year is change. So, okay, final question then. At what point should somebody who is watching this say, okay, I'm in over my head here, I better talk to a tax accountant or a tax lawyer?
The second that red flag is noticed, I mean, we offer free consultations, as I'm sure a lot of people do, especially in these trying and difficult times. We're happy to go over some of the information with you about your scenario and assess it. If a legal relationship needs to get started after that, we're happy to discuss the logistics of it. But if you're already thinking, I didn't qualify, I may not be eligible, I don't know if I completed my calculations correct for all of the different moving parts and requirements, it's always a good idea to figure that out before the CRA comes knocking, because like I said, the timelines are going to be tight.
So what we will do is I'm going to put your contact information on the show notes on YouTube. So if I'm somebody and it's like, yeah, you know what, I was working all through the summer and I was collecting CERB, I know I'm in trouble. I did it because I thought I had to, but okay, now I know I'm in trouble. That would probably be a classic person who should be reaching out to you then.
Absolutely, Doug.
And so you would have a chat on the phone with them, and then from there it would be, okay, well, here's a few steps I'll help you with. Here's what it's going to cost you, and you'd give them an idea up front what kind of legal bills they're going to be faced with.
Absolutely. And oftentimes, if it's a situation that taxpayers, after the free consultation, can go in and try things or put forward some effort on their own before having to retain us, we often guide them down that path, especially during these economic difficult times.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I think in a lot of cases, a bit of advice up front helps. And then if things do get, more serious, well, then, okay, you need someone kind of holding you by the hand through it. So
right.
Tell us the name of your firm again.
Rosen Kirshen Tax Law. And
Rosen, R-O-S-E-N. How do you spell Kirshen?
Kirshen.
It was like a trick question there. You had to think about that. And what is the best way for people to reach you? Website? How should they do that?
RKTaxLaw.com has a comprehensive booking system that links to mine and my business partners' calendars, and you can go in, put in a brief information and description about your situation, your contact details, and then one of our support clerks reaches out to schedule the appointment and confirm the time and details.
So you said RKTaxLaw.com.
Correct.
Cool. And what geographic areas do you cover?
The tax system is a federal system, so we're able to provide advice all across the country, whether you're in Ontario or otherwise. We are in technologically capable times where we're able to provide effective service all across the country.
Gotcha. And because it's 2020, well, we're all doing everything over Zoom and the telephone, so it's not like people are coming into your office anyway. So excellent. Well, I appreciate that. There's a whole bunch of practical advice there, and I'm going to put some detailed show notes over on YouTube with some links to all of this. So Jason, thanks very much for being here.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you. So as I said, I will put links to all of this on YouTube, and rktaxlaw.com is how you can reach Jason Rosen if you wish more information. For those of you watching on YouTube, it certainly helps me to get this important information out to people who need it. So Please subscribe, like, hit the notification button so you don't miss a podcast. That's our show for today. Until next week, I'm Doug Hoyes. That was Debt Free in 30.